Hello, everybody. Good evening. I would like to welcome all our guests, our students, our teachers, our friends, and I would like to introduce with a few words our speaker of today, Alice Cabaret. Hello. We are in the second lecture of the November Talks 2022 series. And thanks to the Foundation Sto, we can continue for the 7th year now. Alice Cabaret is a very special guest for me because she's a guest representing the very, very young generation. It means the generation more or less very close to the students that are here now, that are studying in a world which is changing very fast. They're going to enter a world where their profession and their jobs might be quite different to 5, 10, 15 years ago. And I considered it very important to have somebody of this very young generation come here to November Talks and to talk to you. Alice Cabaret is a French urban strategist. She is not an architect then. She really studied urban strategy at the Sciences Po in Paris, and then she received a certificate in property development of the ESPI group. She's the founder of the Street Society, which provides strategic solutions to build, transform, and activate public spaces, buildings, or neighborhoods through research, urban design, community engagement, and art installations. The Street Society is built around a global collaborative ecosystem of talents which gathers designers, illustrators, architects, urban designers, engineers, scientists, and researchers who bring unexpected perspectives and expertise into the field of urban neighborhood transformation, turning underused spaces into new spaces. Alice is also the co-founder of S-City, which is Science and City company, which looks at the intersection between neurosciences, cognitive sciences, and urbanism to create cities that have a positive impact on our mental and physical health. I think I don't want to talk more because I would like you to take the floor. And thank you for coming and accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Dobry den. I'd first like to thank the Faculty of Architecture for inviting me to present today, and I'm very excited to be here and to share some of my experiences and current thoughts about today's theme, Time for a Change. I'm also really much looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have after the talk, so I also wanted to thank all of you for being here tonight. So I am Alice Cabaret. I'm an urban strategist. I've been practicing for about 10 years now, first in Johannesburg for 5 years, where I lived, and mainly in Paris. I'm the founder of the Street Society, which is an urban strategy agency based in Paris. We bring life to underused spaces, mostly and generally unloved spaces. And to do that, we use urban research, we do space analysis and programming, and we also do creative installations. I'm also the founder of Science and the City, which is a collective that works on the intersection between neuroscience and urbanism. I'm really interested in the connection between people and places and how we can activate change in our cities. And change that is more, let's say, local, that is more collaborative, in a way that is more also open. This is why the Street Society is structured around a platform that fosters partnerships and collaborations with people that have very different backgrounds and perspectives. such as, like artists, scientists, designers. And our idea is really to bring diversity to the field of architecture and urbanism and to bring fresh perspective. Because it is time for a change. As I speak, and we are at the end of 2022, it seems that we are living in a period of accelerated change, especially with regards to geopolitics, to social dynamics, to the global economy, and obviously to climate. We are in a critical situations where decisions must be made urgently to ensure the best possible global future. And our cities have a massive responsibility in achieving this. But it's also, been time for a change for a long time. I'm part of a generation of urbanists that have to learn from the previous failures and mistakes of urban projects. We have to also unlearn a lot of the things that we were taught, about limiting processes and norms. And, we have to learn from the failures of projects, especially with regards to the misuse of resources, of energy, and of space. So we are caught in a situation really between the urgency to act fast, and at the same time, we have to also take time to reflect, And as says the philosopher, Isabel Stengers, think we must, but also act we must. So in this situation, it's very easy to feel hopeless or, overwhelmed, which can lead to either, over-rushed action or to anxious inaction. So a critical question is, how can we actually activate urban change? Activate in a way that is targeted, that is impactful, that is collaborative. And how do we implement changes then that are more conscious and more respectful of both human but also non-human lives? Also, how do we find, freedom? How do we find hope? And how do we find joy in this process? So these are very big questions for a very limited amount of time that we have together tonight. But it all starts with the way we imagine the future city to be. Italo Calvino says, cities, like dreams, are made of desires and fears. So what are the desires and what are the fears that populate, our visions and our imagination about cities today? I have asked artificial intelligence image generators to show us how the city of Prague will look like in the future. And as you can see, the future city of Prague is, this collection of urban bubbles and towers reaching to the sky, and there's some, heritage buildings also in the mix, A very questionable interpretation of our desires with regards to future urban living. Now, what if we ask the same question to younger generations today? What does the future city look like? And let me share with you a story. At the moment in Paris, we're working with a school on an art installation, which will be on the facade of the school on the street. And the art installation will be about the future city. So we've started working on this project, and we work with the teaching team, because we're going to have a lot of workshops coming with the children and high school students about this art project. And I really want to share with you what the art teacher said to me. She said, it's difficult for us to work on the topic of the city because every time I've asked my students to draw a city, and especially in the last years, they're giving me back these drawings of destroyed cities, of dark places, of violence, of places of despair. And she says that this phenomenon has been accentuated in the last years. So here you can see, she sent me an example, of one of the drawings she got from the children. And here you can see the city of Paris with dark, empty streets, where monuments seems to be the only remains of a past urban civilization, and where the only options are either to live up in the tower or deep, deep down underground. So while the AI is offering us, you know, this artificially lit visions of the city of tomorrow, there seems to be an increasing incapacity for younger generations to actually envision positive urban futures. And I mean, why would they? Contemporary images of our cities in the global media look like dystopian scenes from science fiction movies or video games, you know, empty metropolises, war in cities, scenes of violence on the streets and areas hit by extreme climate events. Fiction suddenly became reality, and reality seems almost unreal. The past years have shown multiple signs of major structural vulnerabilities of our urban infrastructures and systems with regards to health, to climate, and political crisis. And more than ever, we are reminded that we humans are part of a wider ecological system, a system that is extremely fragile and that is showing signs of increased degeneration. Cities are both the cure and the cause of this polycrisis, especially in terms of climate change. As you can read, cities occupy only 3% of the world's surface, but they account for about 75% of global carbon emissions. I mean, as architects, as planners, as urban strategists, we have a huge responsibility to make cities not only more resilient to face future crises, but to actually make them part of the solution to building better futures. And for that, we can also leverage on the assets of cities, for example, the capacity to, you know, share spaces, service, infrastructure. So, just like the singer and poet Arlo Parks, as you can see, is wandering through a cityscape that is slowly unraveling, our generation is navigating through extreme uncertainty. We are learning, as the philosopher Donna Haraway says, to stay with the trouble. And that means deconstructing a lot of our inherited norms and values about growth, about planning, about the use of space and resources, you know, about autonomy and about the alliances that we make. This moment we're living, you know, of uneasy tension between the past and the future expresses itself in contemporary culture and subcultures around spaces. So this, for example, is the case for the liminal spaces aesthetics, which is very popular at the moment in cultural practices and productions. Liminal spaces are spaces of waiting, they're spaces of transition, they're spaces in between, as if they were frozen in time. Empty parking garages, dead malls, unpopulated passageways and corridors. In a very famous quote, Gramsci says, "The old world is dying, the new world is slow to appear, and in this chiaroscuro emerge monsters." So the liminal spaces really evoke a current state of anxious wait, or maybe even passivity at a time of transition. In this situation, it's easy to understand why there's such a strong and growing popular appeal towards bucolic rather than, you know, urban environments. So cottagecore is an aesthetic that boomed on social media during the pandemic. And actually, some studies have shown that every time there's been a spike in COVID-19 cases, there's also been a spike in mentions of cottagecore. As you can see, you know, cottagecore is really an aesthetic that is glorifying slow living in full connection to nature, with many references to an idealized past. So we can actually wonder whether we're looking forward to an urban future. What's interesting with both these examples that I just presented is really the relation to time. In the case of liminal spaces, time seems to be stopped. In the case of a cottagecore, the time is either slowed down or even rewinded. And I think this is very revealing of our period in which time seems to be accelerating and desynchronizing also with our natural rhythms. And this unbalanced relationship to natural time is one of the symptoms of what I called the syndrome of urban burnout, a situation in which many of our cities are or seem to be in today. So cities that are burning out are, consuming more resources than they produce. They suffer from a state of saturation, in particular with regards to space and to infrastructure, and are inefficient in terms of providing fair, equal opportunities of creating space, for example, safe and healthy environments for both human and, as I say, non-human beings living in them. This means that we need to pay much closer attention to how we use resources and key resources such as space, such as energy and time, because we can't afford to waste them anymore. One solution is obviously to reuse existing buildings, to transform spaces rather than demolish them, for example, through adaptive reuse. That is the case for most of the projects that we work on with the Street Society. We work on the transformation of historical building, of industrial spaces, sometimes old office spaces, mixed-use infrastructure. And our work for each of these spaces aims at really assessing its transformation potential and designing a bespoke strategy. Now, many of the projects that we see at the moment are very ambitious regeneration plans for buildings that were actually built less than 50 years ago. And these buildings, they started decaying 10 years ago, so it means that the lifespan is actually about 40 years, which is much shorter than a human life. Can you imagine, the waste of resources and time in this process? It's interesting to note that cycles of urban regeneration seem to be actually shortening, while signs of global degeneration seem to be increasing. And it's not a coincidence that our contemporary societies, are so obsessed with the idea of regeneration. Regeneration means, the word regenerate means to create again, to be born again. And I think we must be careful that our constant focus on regeneration actually, we should be careful that it doesn't blind us, like the promise of this eternal spring, where everything is constantly new and constantly blooming and constantly fresh. Because we must also learn from degeneration. We as urbanists, but also I think as a society, we must be braver to look at degeneration, to understand its roots, its causes, its process, so we don't get caught, in these accelerated cycles driven by rushed renewal. So this calls for a complete paradigm shift in the way that we approach architecture and urbanism. So I told you earlier about urban burnout being, this period of time driven by the appeal of the new, of the constant regeneration and growth. Instead, the philosophy of care, it's a philosophy that values attention and responsibility, and it calls for an attitude of empathy, an attitude of humility, an attitude of interconnectedness. Care is defined by the philosopher John Tronto as a species of activity that includes everything we do to maintain, contain, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. And that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment. The application of this philosophy to urban processes are quite exciting. Instead of demolishing, we need to learn how to heal. Instead of constantly renewing, we need to learn how to maintain. And instead of automatically building, we need to assess, the necessity even to build in the first place. Complete shift of paradigm and this question of assessing even the necessity to build in the first place and to develop a philosophy of care, which is more about interconnection and the place that our natural environments play in our cities, remind me of a beautiful scene from this documentary called Le Jolimet, which was shot in 1962 by Chris Marker and Pierre Lhomme in Paris. They were asking questions in Paris to people. They were saying, "Are you happy?" To people living in Paris. And in the documentary, they filmed this interaction between two architects. They're in this place in Paris undergoing massive transformation. There's towers everywhere. And the first architect asked, so what would you do on the site? And the answer of the other one, which is much shorter here, is completely amazing. He says, well, I'd start by planting trees. You know, everyone will have their own little garden. And kids will be playing there like monkeys and squirrels, flying from tree to each house. And we could create what he says, wonders. You know, things that are joyful, connected to nature, you see? I mean, planting instead of building, curating connections instead of separation. There's many things to learn here. And this general change of paradigms and this philosophy, I think, is something that really inspired us when we worked on the project that I'm going to present now, which is called Le CELP in Lyon, which is an exchange hub it's in the city of Lyon, around the neighborhood called Perrache. And it's a project we won this year with the architect Dietmar Fechtinger. So I must tell you, this is one of the most hated buildings in Lyon, in France. It was built in the 1970s. I'm talking about the 1970s and the state it is in right now, obviously. It was built in the 1970s over a highway, which was previously a beautiful historical green space. And our ambition as a team was really to turn this unloved building into a building, you know, that would be maybe one of the most loved buildings in the city. And I mean, love is a very important tool for urban resilience, because when people love a building, when they attach to it, even if it degenerates, even if it evolves, you know, it forms such a strong basis, such a strong thing that you can use for the future transformation of this building. So this is a highly, you know, complex and technical, piece of infrastructure over a highway that connects also the train station. And the strategy we developed at the Street Society focused on three main aspects. The idea of a connection, really, the local connection, and reconnecting this building, which is today, it's really a frontier, you know, between two neighborhoods, into something that would actually bring the neighborhoods together with lots of different urban pathways. In terms of connection, we were also thinking about what the building could give back to the area in terms of resources. We worked on the notion of diversity. We introduced diversity in the program. It's about 25,000 square meters of program inside. So bringing different elements and also working on the synergies between the different bricks, you know, of the program that we decided to put on the building. Diversity is also linked to the notion of circularity that we wanted to introduce, and we worked a lot on the notions of cycles, the cycle of food, for example, with a food hub located at the base of the building that is connected to the bioregion of Lyon, and how the food cycles in the building have been extremely well curated, you know, also with workshops and the professionals and the local community. Natural cycles, and how do you reconnect the building to natural cycles? We created 80,000 square meters of new landscaped surface, which will be adapted to Lyon's future climate. And finally, transformability, obviously with what I said earlier, which is the capacity of the building to evolve with time, with unplanned spaces and a flexible framework that we maintain. So this way we increased its potential for future transformation. Petite pause. Rethinking our buildings to natural cycles, just as I mentioned, and ecosystems is really critical. So I told you I co-founded this structure, this collective called Science and the City with neuroscientists. And with neuroscientists, I actually learned that urban environments are not adapted to our brains, because actually cities evolve much faster than our brains. It means that it creates mental fatigue. You know, we live in situations of sensory overloads with city. That means that we need what we call cognitive restoration, which can be achieved, for example, if you immerse yourself in a natural environment. For example, if you walk 50 minutes in a park, your work capacity memory, your working memory will increase of 20%. And if you walk 50 minutes in a city, it will just stay the same. So that's what we call cognitive restoration. These stats are actually quite interesting. People spending 2 hours or more per week in nature are significantly more likely to report good health and life satisfaction. But what I want to say with that is that the access to green spaces is literally vital. Researchers from Harvard and Brigham and Women's Hospital found that women, because this study really focused on the data on women, but it could apply, I think, to a wider population, it's not been proven yet, in the USA, living in the greenest areas had a 12% lower death rate than women living in the least green areas. So higher levels of green vegetation were associated with this decreased mortality. And that is why offering an equitable access to nature in our cities is so vital, not only for human health, but also for animal health and environmental health. So we saw that the urban burnout creates environments that are neither beneficial, to us as humans or to the planet. The lack of time, the lack of space, the lack, of access to nature are conducive to escapism. And I think really looking at the notion of escapism is essential to our current practice as urbanists, with an increasing tension between connection and disconnection. The desire for space in our current metropolises is strongly linked to escapism. And to illustrate this, I chose this ad directed by Spike Jonze for a prominent technology brand, because I believe it's very revealing of our relationship to space, in global north, let's say, metropolises. So let's watch an edited version of it.
Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry.
I'ma ride it till it's over. 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 And don't all this new music sound the same? Yeah, we must be getting old and gray. We left early, girl, that band with anyway. We went home and left our clothes up in the living space. Say, would you stay if your heart had the power? Or would you run and find another life to imitate? It's important that we make the best of short time. You can never be my one and only anyway. I'ma ride it till it's over.
So, in this clip, we saw a potentially, burnt out woman, tired, trying to navigate a city that is grey, that is unfriendly, with a big lack of space. And she arrives at home, and she uses technology to, to create space, to expand her own flat. So the lack of space here led to the creation of a fantasy space. It's interesting, just as a side note, to note that in most metropolises, the size of flats, the size of housing has been decreasing. A study has shown that around Paris, the surface area for new housing developments actually have decreased 15% in the last 20 years. And dense and overcrowded environments have an impact on our stress levels, and it's been amazingly shown also by the anthropologist Edward Hall in his book Hidden Dimension, which explores the question of human perceptions of space. So our protagonist here is craving space, as you can see, but she's craving something else, right? Connection. It's so interesting to note the presence, of this mirror, which is a strong utopian figure, according to Foucault. what he says is that a mirror is a space without a space. And in this space, our protagonist meets her double, introducing the very contemporary figure of the avatar. The lack of mental or physical space in our cities affect us and make us want to escape them. This quote from the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman is revealing of the role that technology plays in contemporary urban escapism, as we're going to see with our next example. Turning on your phone is turning off the street. And the next example, I think, is really much about cutting off the sound of the street. Just a few stats on that. You know, sound pollution, mostly generated by cities, is really a public health matter. The exposure to sound, chronic exposure, can lead to cardiovascular disease, mental health disorder, and for kids, learning disabilities. You know, 20% of the European population, they live in areas where sound levels are considered dangerous. And in France, the health cost of sound pollution equals 140 billion per year. So in this ad, again, directed by Sam Brown, technology is presented as a solution to escape the street, to, you know, escape this sensory overload that I was talking about earlier. And it answers really our desires to reconnect to ourselves. Let's watch it. So technology as a way to escape the street, and with a paradox of these impressions of freeing your body, which are actually quite constrained and pushed in the urban spaces, you know, in the urban environments. So this question of, you know, sensorial disconnection from the street inspired one of our interventions that we made during a creative residency in 2019. During this intervention, we actually stopped people on the street and we asked them what they were listening to. So obviously when you put your headphones on, you're in a certain attitude towards like people around you, and you don't really want to, you're not in a very engaged way or aiming at connecting with other people. But we got amazing encounters, and people shared with us the tunes, the tracks that they were listening to. And then we invited them on the same day to a party that we organized in a gallery where the creative residency was happening, with a micro dance floor, where we played all the tracks from the neighborhood. We actually even created an online playlist for the neighborhood. And we were so amazed to see that so many people, actually, that we met during the day, came and danced. So that's an interesting, let's say, creative experiment about how you can turn a phenomenon of like disconnection into a moment of, you know, joyful connection. There's an interesting dynamic to explore really between the degeneration of our urban reality and the increasing appeal and access to virtual worlds, with the promise of disconnection that they offer. One can think of the shacks in the movie Ready Player One by Steven Spielberg, based on a book. So it's set on in a dystopian 2045, humanity uses the Oasis, which is a virtual reality simulation, to escape the real world. And most of them live in the stacks, which are this, you know, vertical makeshift villages. So this reference really raises a critical question. Will the energy spent on building virtual worlds and escaping into them distract us from spending actual energy improving our urban reality? Or will we find inspiration, maybe, and connection in virtual worlds that can have a positive impact on our urban reality? The idea of connection definitely seems to be the promise of most virtual worlds and the metaverse. So while the topic of this talk is time for a change, it's interesting to note that the Everywhere game slogan is time for a new world. Everywhere is an open world game under development, which is directly inspired by the concept of oasis that we've seen before, a world which will be co-created with its users. So one can wonder if it hasn't become, in a certain way, easier to be involved and to collaborate on the creation of virtual worlds rather than to be involved in the real world. It certainly offers opportunities, you know, in terms of design and freeing up imagination, maybe coming up to solutions, we know, with solutions that could be applicable in reality. But there are high stakes in designing these worlds. I mean, who designs these spaces? How do we make sure that these spaces don't replicate inequalities and violence, as it's already been the case and reportedly on virtual platforms? Also, how do we introduce a diversity of culture and voices in the design process? So it's really fascinating now to observe that online worlds are now inspiring real urban projects. So the Line, as you may know, is a controversial project aiming at building a megacity in the Saudi Arabian desert. And the city will expand over 170 kilometers and house 9 million residents. So we talked about the figure of the mirror earlier, and it's interesting to know that this megacity of the Line here is literally designed as a mirror, a place without a place. In the presentation video of the project, you can see the protagonist is bored and lonely in a grey city, and then she becomes attracted to a shining light. You know, she runs towards it and she jumps into it, just as we would jump into an alternative reality. Yeah, this one doesn't have sound, but you can imagine. Grayer urban environments, you know, dense, the attractive light to then jump in this universe, where you become a character, a video, you know, a video game character. You can fly, the building with the mirroring effect, where nature is dense, water is accessible. So all these resources that were once freely accessible become really much, you know, into one same space where you would find social connection and happiness, apparently. So it seems that we are getting caught, you know, in this infinite loop where fiction and reality mirror each other. And this infinite loop, the frontier, you know, between real and unreal is becoming thinner. Our real urban environments sometimes even serve as backdrops for humans embodying avatars and video games character. I mean, these two videos are so viral. They they count for more than 3.5 million views online. And it's interesting to note that Venice, a heritage city which is threatened by climate change, as well as what you can see here, looks like a liminal space in Tokyo, have been selected as backdrops to, you know, recreate this uncanny reality of humans becoming avatars. I mean, it raises an interesting question. Is the city, you know, becoming a background and a playground instead of a place that we actually live in? Artificial and dreamscape architecture, and that's going to be my last example about escapism, you know, play on this unclear boundary between the real and the fake with online realistic renderings of dream places. Dreamscapes are made with spatial modeling softwares by 3D artists that work at the intersection between interior design and technology. It's a very popular trend. For example, the artist Paul Milinski recently made NFT history with his work auctioned at over $500,000 of a dreamscape. Dreamscapes, as you can see, they bring, you know, the sense of calmness, of quietness, of softness that highly contrasts with our real urban environments. And most of the artists, you know, I've done a bit of research about that, expressed actually happiness about the freedom of working on projects that could just escape the constraints of budget and of constructions. One of them says, nothing about these spaces are in any way tied to reality, and that's the joy of it. And it's interesting to note how these dreamscape renderings now have actually a real impact on interior design trends in the real world. So we are in an infinite loop in which fiction and reality mirror each other, bouncing back our fears and desires from one world to another. Time to drink. So against the temptation of separation and disconnection, how can we actually cultivate and curate connection in our urban spaces? I think for me this is very linked to the notion of urban presence, leading us to interrogate, what it means to be present in our urban space, being present ourselves, aware of our senses, aware of our emotions, and also sharing presence with other people and other species. So I believe that an increased presence and an increased quality of connection is a huge step towards action to actually improve our urban environments. You remember how the slogan from the Line project was promising, new wonders for the world, putting emphasis again on the new. This actually reminded me of a collection of essays that I read recently from Rachel Carson, who is an ecological writer, called The Sense of Wonder. And in this book, she illustrates, how critical our senses and our personal experience of nature is if we want to protect it. So it's really linking back to the care philosophy that we were talking about earlier. And in the same way, I think finding the courage to physically and emotionally reconnect to our imperfect urban environments is a critical step towards action to improve them. And the notion of sense here is really critical. So I'm going to show you a few examples in which we explored, this notion of connection. This is a map, sensorial mapping that we do. That is a tool that we use to really explore this invisible urban layers that have a massive impact on the way that we engage with space and with each other on the street. So this is a map that we do with neuroscientists. We ask people to report, and we collect sensorial data from people, from the 5 senses on urban spaces. And it really brings depth to our more traditional elements of urban analysis. It also reveals big differences of sensorial perception of the environment. And that's very linked to the topic of neurodiversity, which is not, I think, being taken enough into account in the way we design cities today. So this really calls for a more inclusive approach to the design of urban spaces. In the same way, we also collected data from urban users. We've done this project on 8 public spaces so far in the south of Paris, where we use 6 basic emotions, and we ask people to report their level of emotions according to spots in the public spaces. And this is a work in progress, but it really brings depth, and it reveals things that you wouldn't have found, on a traditional diagnostic and a traditional urban diagnostic. What fascinates us with the emotional mapping is really the comparison of results in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of ability, because you can really then be aware of the difference of perception and of experiences in the urban spaces. I feel this. Non, bon, je sais pas. Vous m'entendez? Can you hear me? Well, I can scream. I already scream, I think. So beyond the collection of information, the process of mapping senses and emotions make urban users also more aware of the environment. What I like about these tools of sensorial mapping and emotional mapping is that you not only collect information. By collecting information, you have an impact actually on the users on the street, because you ask them to reconnect to the senses and the emotions, which they rarely do in this way with urban space, and then maybe, realize that some things are wrong in the urban environment, and who knows, maybe want to take action on them. Also, by sharing the different maps according to our different level of experience is also a good way to raise awareness of the critical differences that we have when we experience urban spaces. This is an experience about social connection. And as you may know, I mean, Eric Klinenberg is an author that wrote Palaces for the People and that studied the effects of the Chicago heat wave on 2 neighborhoods. He says and explains how social connection is actually vital. So neighborhoods that have higher level of social connection within their communities are more able to face crisis like climate crisis or any crisis. It's a factor for resilience. So based on this notion that social link was very important, we've done a recent experiment with the experience designer Isabella Nardini that questions the connection in urban spaces, you know, the connection to ourselves, to other people, and to the urban environment. We call this experience passing by. Passing by because we were also interested by the figure of the passerby, the stranger that you rarely speak to. And it was actually a really emotional experience. What we did is we gathered 30 people that didn't know each other on the street, and we curated a route in Paris that was themed around 3 big sections. One section around the theme of desire, one section about the theme of death, and one about dreams. Then what we did is we distributed cards with, you know, philosophical questions on them. For example, what have you learned from death? And the people had to find a match with the card to then walk with them for the duration of the section of the route, so it can be 10, 20 minutes, and talk together about this philosophical question, which gave extremely interesting results because the question was itself, you know, in connection, thank you, to the urban environment. And by doing this experiment, we really question what social connection is, you know, how this connection to yourself, to the other people, and to the urban environment is actually critical to our urban experience. What I want to show you with this experiment is also the power, you know, of strategic intervention to encourage reflection and action, because we got so many then feedback of these people about the way it actually changed something in them in the interaction with the urban spaces or their openness to connect with strangers. So we're collecting data about that right now. But that's, I think, something very interesting to explore and to say that you can curate your own also experiments in the city. Now, connection is a condition for collective action. For this last chapter, I really want to share with you how small actions can make all the difference and why we should really open the field of urbanism and architecture to non-specialists. First, the question of opening tools. This is a tool that we've developed for actually a public client that wanted us to explore the lived potential, espace vécu, of public spaces in the area in the south of Paris. So we've developed this tool that is applicable to any public space in France, where you would have to find and fill a questionnaire about the type of criteria that you would find in the public space, and then you would match with a profile. So we selected 4 different profiles and typology of public spaces according to the opportunity to develop more life. And then for your profile, you would have access to recommendations about how to, curate, how to transform your public space to increase its life potential. Based on that, this tool is under development, but we would really love to make it accessible, so anyone that wants to have an impact on the public space can use quite technical analysis tool from urbanism, then have a match between the public space and a certain profile to then have recommendations to change positively the public space to increase its life potential. Another tool which also shows, the power of focused energies in space and time. That's a residency that we co-created with architect Gemma Mila called Carta Infinita, and that we experimented for the first time at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. The concept of Carta Infinita is really about valuing, you know, the contributions and the perspectives from people that are not urbanists, but at the same time, I really strongly believe that everyone is an urbanist. So we curated this group of 15 people: musicians, artists, scientists, writers, you know, people from different backgrounds, and we explored for a certain number of days the Lido area in Venice to collect elements to understand this area. So, sorry about the sound. Elements. So everybody would have their own perspective, right, on the urban environment. And we collected together these elements that we gathered in the French pavilion to then create a performed map of the neighborhood. And the results we got from this were quite amazing, because you would find practices and approaches that are so different to you as an architect or trained architect or urbanist, but that brings so much depth to your understanding of the people living in an area, of the area itself, that it created this beautiful, amazing, multi-layered map of the area. The idea also, you know, of gathering people in a space with a certain action and at certain time makes and produces incredible results in terms of urban research. A nice also example, something that I worked on in South Africa in the neighborhood that I was the urban strategist for, called the Maboneng Precinct in Johannesburg. This was a program that we called Grind Cities, Global Regeneration Initiative for Neighborhood Development. The idea was to use empty buildings and free spaces to offer free workspace to young professionals or students in the field of to young professionals and students. We really had an open door policy. People that wanted to use the space just had to develop a project that had a connection with the neighborhood. So some people came here to do, you know, their research project. Some came here to launch a business and start a business. And we had this beautiful experiment of these residencies lasting from a few weeks to a few months, of people just having access to a space to experiment. What I want to show with this example is that, I mean, it created so many connections and so much services and new things for the neighborhood that it was very interesting, but we need to make space for experimentation and collaboration. And we need to make spaces in which we would celebrate also, or at least not be scared of failure, and try and test ideas for the neighborhood. So that was a very successful example in terms of that. Connection in terms of learning from the temporary. That's another project that we worked on in Paris, which is called the Eco-District Saint-Vincent-de-Paul in the 14th arrondissement of Paris. This was a former hospital that was empty and then activated during 5 years with a temporary urbanism period of time where there was housing, there were shops, there were services, and a lot of different initiatives, lots of workspaces as well for NGOs and associations. So for 5 years we had this amazing concentration of energy happening in this building. And our role as the Street Society was to analyze what we learned from the 5 years of temporary occupation, to then integrate the learnings into the permanent development plans for the eco-district, which is under construction. So how do you learn, for example, about how public spaces were used in a more free context? How were shops operating? How do you then put the design into the permanent design for the project, and also invent new ways of managing spaces in a way that is maybe more collaborative? And the two final projects I'm going to show you are more about art installations. Once again, the importance and the impact that strategic, localized project can have on a neighborhood. So this, you know, I told you we like to work on unloved spaces. This was a very unloved space in the neighborhood of Le Marais in Paris, a historically gay neighborhood. The space was completely, you know, avoided and really identified as one of the worst for the area. the project was inspired by a research published by UCL, saying that 50% of LGBTQ plus spaces had closed down in the last 5 years. And you know, these places were places of activism, they were places of freedom. So we decided in this historically gay neighborhood, as I said, to create a mural to, you know, collect stories that was made by collecting stories from the communities about some of the spaces that made a difference in their life, you know. We had this amazing, you know, engagement with people from the communities that submitted a building that are now part, actually, of the 50 buildings that were drawn on the 360 degrees art installation in Le Marais. We recorded them as well, to record the voices of the memories of these places that had closed down and what it meant for them. And all of these interviews were published then into an Instagram platform, so the Instagram page for the artwork that you can listen to when you visit the place. The production of the artwork itself with the artist Daniel van den Noen was very collaborative, and we also involved people living in the buildings that, you know, the building above, which is social housing. And a lot of people came and helped making the space great. The space was supposed to be up only for 3 years. It's still up today. And it really became this place, you know, from no-go to must-go, with no signs of tagging, no sign of deterioration, versus before you constantly had the signs. So I really love, you know, this idea of having stories that relate to urban heritage and individual and collective memories in the public space, make these stories visible, and stories that are actually often stories of love in one of what was previously the most unloved corners of Paris. The last project is a project that was commissioned by the cultural organization The Bent Way, based in Toronto. And the facade that you can see that was supposed to receive, that now received an art installation, is located in an area that is undergoing massive transformation. So we saw the opportunity here to really connect with children in the area. And this time we framed the question. It's not like the experience I told you at the beginning from the art teacher when she doesn't frame the question about urban futures. We asked kids in the area to show us what their dream street was. And we received, you know, so many drawings from kids of this area about their dream streets. And we made their dreams come true in an artwork. We selected with 3 illustrators elements from the drawings to then recreate this street, which would be at the scale of children. What we also wanted to do with this project is raise awareness about the experience of kids in the city, which could be improved on so many levels. The idea for the art installation was to, you know, create a backdrop, like a background where kids could also take photos and invent movies and live in these different elements, you know, in this different, and interact, you know, with the different universes that were represented on the facade. And the artwork was supposed to only last 3 months. It's still up today. It actually, you know, it's a destination that is appreciated by the community. And I just wanted to share with you that, you know, maybe in this situation, escapism is also and can also be a useful tool to imagine better urban futures together. Thank you.
So thank you very much. It was very nice. It reminded me, some of the projects reminded me of the 1990s here in Prague, because it was a period after the Velvet Revolution, and there was a lot of communal feelings and a lot of discussions and a lot of street society happenings.
Good.
And I just completely forgot about that. And I just thought, well, but this was happening way back, 20 years ago in Prague. But the students were too young to remember that. So does anybody have any questions? This time it's not over the Slido, it's directly. I can imagine yes, too.
I have a question. How do you net emotions in the urban space?
Thanks so much for asking that. Are you ready for a technical answer? Or?
Yes.
The collection of data is easier than the mapping of data. So actually, if you have any ideas about that, I'd love to hear them, or any one of you, because this is really a work in progress and we want to improve that. So we collect data by standing in a public space and asking people, free participants, at certain times, if they want to go on a route with us that would go for, we select, areas that would be 20 by 20 meters. And in this way, we collect data for the zones. We select about 10 zones per public spaces, so public spaces of about that size. And then we give them a questionnaire where they have for each of the zone, 20 by 20, give a rating for each of the 6 emotions from 0 to 10. And then we would use a software that let's say, clears the extreme results that we can find from an individual to another in terms of how they would rate the emotions in general, and then represent the emotions according to the average number per emotion per zone on the map. That are the 6 basic academic emotions that we use. That's why we selected these ones, mostly used in urban research. In academic research.
So it's an emotion based on the space?
Yeah. We frame the question saying, what is the emotion, or how do you feel more generally, or mostly in the space? How does the space generally make you feel? So that it's not exactly in the moment. We frame the question so it opens the question to the experience and previous experience of space as well.
Would you say that there could be an emotion like intimacy?
Intimacy as an emotion?
Yes.
I would have to ask my neuroscientist friends. I'm not sure. It's a pure emotion. But tell me why you asked that?
No, because I'm working on things. I just wanted to ask if you had some.
We can talk about it after. I think it's intimacy relates to more complex emotional.
Yeah. So it's more. In a private space, not urban space.
Oh, you could do that at home as well.
Okay.
I guess you could feel, you could analyze this result and have a filter about intimacy by linking some emotions to the feeling also of intimacy.
There was a second question. Somebody had his hand up. Yes, please.
I have maybe 2 questions. First one is, you said we work with neurologists, and it's kind of unique cooperation with urbanist and neurologists. Could you tell us what is the most advantages of this cooperation, or what is the biggest advantage for you to cooperate with such a field?
Was it the biggest collaboration, you say, or was it the most extreme type of collaboration we had?
Maybe example would be nice, but why would you do that? What is the main reason for doing this cooperation? Because it's so unique and so fascinating cooperation.
Yes, and it's neuroscientists and people, not neurologists, and people working in cognitive science as well, just to be clear about that. I mean, you can't work on cities if, according to me, you're not interested in emotions and perceptions of space. So I was surprised actually when I started, my practice, that these were not so well documented. They were not researched. They were not taken into account in projects development. So my interest was really about how can we go deeper in the quantitative and qualitative analysis of that, and how can we collect research about the impact of volumes, of materiality, of maybe colors on us, And that's how, by curiosity, I explored this field, and I met people that we shared so much in common about exploring the intersection between architecture and urbanism and neuroscience that we co-founded this collective. And now this collective Science and the City is also working directly with architects on, in a very iterative way, on improving some of the plans based on the academic research that we collected. For example, about the height-width ratio. So it's a fascinating thing. There's an increasing, I think, attraction to that field, and it's growing.
I got information that I have to repeat the questions on the microphone, otherwise we're not having them on the stream. So I'll repeat the second one first, which was about how did you start collaborating with a neuroscientist? Why did you do that? And the first question was, how do you measure, how do you map emotions in space? Any more questions? Yes, please.
With this kind of mapping emotions, apart from nature and space, what were the most joyous places, or just generally spaces where people experience the most joy?
I'll just repeat it. So while you're mapping emotions in space, what were the spaces where people experience most joy?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you. I wish I had more maps to show you, actually. If I think about the data we collected, spaces where people express the most joy, and then you said aside from natural spaces, which are highly connected to joy, are spaces that would be linked to positive past experiences and positive social link building. We had one very revealing example of a marketplace that we, a market square, I think, that we analyzed. On the public space, the city told us, we want to destroy everything. I think there's nothing good about this market square, like people seem very unhappy and it's just bad. So when we started our qualitative and quantitative analysis, also mixing with all the urban diagnostic tools, we were kind of expecting, we always wary, but finding these results. And the levels of joy reported for this market square were much higher than some levels of joy in places of nature and stuff. So we actually wondered why. We explored that question through qualitative interviews, and it appeared that this place was very linked to positive memories of sharing, positive emotions with people and connecting with people and going to the market and finding your neighbor or meeting a friend. And people told us this story about social connection. In some of the other urban diagnostic tools that we use at the Street Society, we rated the feeling of appreciation of space and also the attachment to place. And this market square also had the highest attachment to the place, which is very weird when you look at how the place looks like today, because it's quite degenerated actually. And the city, that's why I wanted to get rid of it. And that completely changed the strategy we then suggested for the city, saying we can't destroy also the social network that is around that square, and we need to respect that it is a very appreciated space in itself. Maybe we don't need to completely destroy it and transform it completely. Maybe there's other things that we could do to improve the space.
Another question? Yes, please.
Relative like some truth or taking the idea of speech, and for me it's also the way how to escape the cities and the metro where there's so much people that you are not feeling comfortable. But isn't there any option how to use the technology just to make people comfortable in the city? And just, the technology is isolating the people and making the bubbles away. So persons like inside and not feeling the city and not feeling the space around. So isn't there any option how to make the city for the people that there won't be the way how to or need how to escape from
So the question was, I'll make it shorter. It was that you were showing technology as one of the means that were used in this escapism technique, that people were using technology to escape the city. And the question was, couldn't the technology be used in a way to stay in the city or to make the city more bearable?
I think that's an excellent question, and we shouldn't disqualify completely technology as a way to completely of this connection. I'm sure, and there are many ways that we can use technology to rebuild connection. I think technology in itself is such a wide, term, depending on what we mean, because it's already in a way building connection. For example, when you see online groups of people that would gather in real life, and the impact it has on public spaces, that's something that is quite happening regularly now. But your question, I think, is more about how could a technology could bring people together and increase connection to the sensorial with the moment. It would have to be developed. I don't have any example in mind. I don't know if any of you have an example in mind of technology that makes me more connected to my environment. No. Even some apps are about disconnect. I mean, I don't have any in mind. Do you? Anyone has something in mind, or is it something the app maybe you're going to develop this app or this technology? Voilà. Yeah, transportation. It increases absolutely, like the experience you have of a space, 100%. Does it make you more connected to your senses, though? I'm not sure. But yes. Yeah. The idea, of the, the idea of this Instagram page where we linked the audio to the artwork was quite interesting, because then you could see, even if it happened not as often as we wished, that when we did the installation, people listening to voices of the people from the communities talking about this particular building and learning more about the building while experiencing the artwork. So I would say that's a close example that I have in mind about something we've done about that. But it was not the main way that people used the artwork by using the Instagram page. It was small, and it was actually quite, voilà, not often.
Anybody else? Any questions? Yes, please.
I would like to ask on the street society itself. You mentioned a lot of projects, architectural, but also a research project. So I would like to ask on this cooperation, how it works, what is. Plus, you mentioned cooperation with neurosciences, sociologists, philosophers, etc. So I would like to ask on what basis you cooperate with them. Are they employed or how it works?
I didn't hear your first question. You mentioned a few projects, including architecture and?
Architectural and research. So
research projects,
kind of institutional, scientific institution.
Scientific research.
Yes, because the question is on the street society itself.
Yeah.
Is it both architectural firm and something like institution for research?
We wouldn't call ourselves a lab, We're not affiliated to any academic partners. That's why even with Science and the City on the side, it's more about data that we gather from academia, and then this data collection for very specific projects, but that's more on the Science and the City side. For the street society, the collaborations operate on a per project basis with experts in very different fields. So it's a very hybrid, very organic way of making new urban projects right now. I think to call ourselves science agency wouldn't work, because I value too much science and the constraints that it gives and the rules you have to respect to have your project purely labeled as science, to not say that we a lab ourselves. But collaborations definitely can happen with scientific experts and partners.
I can specify also the question in a way like, what are your clients? Are they public or are they private?
I didn't mention they're mixed, they're very diverse. Just as the collaborators we have per project approach, our clients are from the private sector, property developers, investors, managers, from the public sector as well. We work with cities, we work with cultural organizations, we work with NGOs, we work with architecture and design firms as well that ask us to sometimes do really a very specific research on something that they can't do. So that's the profile of our clients. They can be also big corporation. Recently we've been approached by one of them to work on a project.
There was somebody up there, yeah.
Okay, so these buildings and streets that are painted on, they look prettier, calmer, warmer. So is there any evidence, or are there any evidences that the crime rate around those places went lower or is lower now?
Crime rate, I only heard the last part of your question, I'm so sorry. Crime rate in?
Yeah, the crime rate around these places, is the crime rate lower now because they are painted on the together there?
The art installation project. We haven't gathered data about crime rates on this particular space, and it's a very good point that you're raising. It would be interesting. The vandalisme, though, I don't know how to translate that in English, but like things when you draw on the walls and when you like deteriorate the environment, have definitely lowered, but I can't give you numbers. It's just by experience we know that the place has been much more respected than before. So for this space, it's completely changed the whole dynamic of the area. Actually, the space around Upside Downtown, the shops couldn't be even rented out around. And within a few months of installing the artwork, 2 galleries opened at the corner, new coffee shops. So you can also maybe have a study on the impact of artworks also on commercial, let's say, attractivity in an area.
Thank you so much.
Alice, you have been working on areas where the crime rate was very high, and the task was to lower the crime rate, didn't you?
I've been in a place where crime rate was very high?
Yes, there were projects of the Street Society where the task was to lower the crime rate, wasn't there?
Yes, alors crime, let's go. So crime rates, yeah. Well, immediately when you ask this question, I can think of Johannesburg, which is a city that has one of the highest crime rates in the world. The project I worked on, I worked on different projects in South Africa, and I think one academic project that was published by Wits University was a research about walking in Johannesburg and the practices of walking and how crime would affect your capacity or not to walk in an area. So that was one very interesting, let's say, research about the connection between crime and urban experience. And then a more, let's say, project-based experience about crime would be the Maboneng precinct, the area that I worked on the east side of Johannesburg, which was an industrial neighborhood empty at 80% that then got transformed into this mixed-use, inclusive neighborhood, very much about creativity with housings and shops and stuff. And when I joined the team, we were only a few of them having this vision of this place being transformed. When I arrived myself in Johannesburg, I was working then for the French government, for the French Development Agency on affordable housing in the city. You have to live in a gated community. And I was trying to walk on the street, and people would ask me, like, why do you walk on the street? It's super dangerous and stuff like that. So for me, working also on this neighborhood was about how we can create a space which is not gated, which would be a neighborhood integrated to the city, where crime wouldn't be controlled like it is in other gated communities. And for that, we were really much inspired by the eyes on the street theory by Jane Jacobs that says that the more you have eyes on the street, people that are active on the street and a bustling, busy street, the less crime rates you would have because people are watching. So that's exactly what we've done with Fox Street, which is an extremely active street, which was not gated, which once again for Johannesburg was a real difference, you know, in the everyday experience of people. And how do you just create street life against crime, and how do you also connect to people so that people know they all have a benefit if there's no crime happening in this area, an economic benefit, a social benefit. So there was this whole dynamic there. For this area, we actually looked at crime rates, and after the 4th year of operating, when this area had actually it was not inhabited, it was mostly the fringes inhabited, but the police sector had one of the highest crime rates in Johannesburg. The crime rate stayed stable at a time where all the other crime rates in the city went up. I don't know if we can draw a conclusion on that, but it's like maybe, and I don't know, the neighborhood contributed to stabilize crime rate. Doesn't sound like a good neighborhood to live in, right? But yeah, that's interesting.
So any other questions? One more?
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. It's a very, very inspiring presentation. We imagine that cities which are made up of, first of all, of men and women, and today more and more diverse LGBT, et cetera, groups, probably have very different perceptions and needs in terms of connectivity, privacy, density. It all sort of goes hand in hand. And then second thought, we live in cities that are more and more diverse culturally. We have much more immigration than we ever had. So we're all living side by side with people from different places, different cultures. And we can imagine that those people have very, very different needs and perceptions about density and connectivity or privacy, etc. Have your studies found that? Do they validate those assumptions? And if they do, what's your advice to us as urban designers, as architects, as the people who translate that information to make successful living and working spaces in cities?
It's a highly complex question. The specificity of needs according to you know who you are. I would actually reverse this question by saying that we need to look more closely at how the city were designed and by who and for who, and how actually lacking diversity in the process of making cities will just reinforce assumptions that you have as part of a certain category of population. And let's be very clear, for architecture and urbanism and property development, it's very much a white, male-driven sector for a number of years before, that were replicating maybe, you know, ideas and space designs that were working for themselves before first, let's say. So there's an excellent book about that called Making Space by Makeshift, that were published already a number of years, maybe in the 1980s, about how space doesn't answer the need, for example, of it's not designed for women or for women with children, but really it's really about how do you reintroduce this diversity in the city design, how people working on cities are more empathetic towards other people's needs. We were talking about neurodiversity before. We were talking about ability in cities. I mean, so many things must still be done, for example, in terms of accessibility of cities. When you think that in Paris, 300 metro stations are completely inaccessible to people in wheelchairs, there's just so much progress to be done just on that, for example. About the question of the different perception of space and the need you would have for space, we've actually done a little film for the Conscious Cities Festival last year, where we analyzed how sound had different meaning for us or for someone that would be, for example, neurodiverse on the autistic spectrum, or for people that, for example, would be blind. So we filmed people, you know, with this very different backgrounds, going on their way to work or telling us how they use or avoid sound in their everyday experience. And for me as an urbanist, it was already so much learning. For example, a lot of the people we interviewed said that the shared street model, you know, the shared street where you would mix pedestrian spaces and transport to have like a more open area where different means of transport would interact with one another. This shared street system doesn't work at all for a lot of people that are neurodiverse, for example, or blind people. But that's the type of urban models that I would recommend to my clients before, because I thought they were just so great and people would just be more careful to one another, but they really hell for a certain category of population. So what I'm saying to you, because I don't have an answer to your question, is really how can we rather reframe how everyone in this room actually, and everyone working on cities has a responsibility to be more empathetic towards other people's experience of space in the first place. Then specifically designed for certain category of population, I'm very wary of that too, but at least taking into account the different ways we engage with space and how it can limit, we can limit ourselves also in the spaces, or how space presents limitations, to us.
Thank you. I think that you're exhausted now.
You can see I'm exhausted.
No, I think there was a lot of questions for Czech audience. There was a lot of questions. We have a little certificate of appreciation for you.
Thank you. This is
and
beautiful.
We thank everybody that came, and I'd like to invite you for next Monday again. And I thank Alice Cabaret for her wonderful lecture and for coming to Prague. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight.